the transformation of sexual codes is a very, very serious thing. And I think our culture is hurtling down that railroad with no idea of where this will go and no idea of whether civilization will be in any level sustainable at the end.
The sexual revolution didn't occur in a vacuum. These ideas developed over time. Today, sexual politics dominate our world. Where are we headed and what can you do about it? You'll get answers today on The Mark Harrington Show. Activist Radio, The Mark Harrington Show is brought to you by Created Equal, and you can support our work or subscribe to our podcast by going to markharringtonshow.com. My guest today is Dr. Carl Trueman, and he is a noted Christian thought leader, also a professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. He's authored several books. His latest is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He also writes for First Things. Dr. Trueman, thanks for being on the program today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Well, one of the reasons we wanted to bring you on is that you're one of our favorites here at Created Equal. We spent the summer, at least part of it, going through your video series on your presentation, Makers of the Modern Revolution, which is part of a series on the Grove City's Great Lectures YouTube page. And we found it very helpful because here at Created Equal, obviously we're an anti-abortion pro-life group, but we understand that abortion just didn't happen in a vacuum, that there's a reason why this is occurring. And it has a lot to do with the past, with the sexual revolution as it involved and related to ethics, law, and culture and history. And so we felt it was important that we cover your book as best as possible by watching your video series. So that's why I was interested in bringing you in, because I wanted to kind of get a little update on what's going on. So in the time that we have together, I just want to jump right into this. Let me just ask you this. You talk about the notion of the modern self in the series and in your book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, good question. I think at the heart of the sort of topics you've raised already, sexual revolution, abortion, etc., there is a fundamental notion of what it means to be a human person, to be a human being that is operating. And I think that notion has changed dramatically over the last 500 or 600 years. If you imagine you were born in medieval Europe, your identity would have been very fixed. Your identity would actually have been given to you basically by the outside world. You'd have been born in one place. You'd have lived in that place for the rest of your life. You'd have died in that place. You'd have been baptized, married, and buried in the same church. Everything about you, or most things about you, would have been fixed. We now live in a world where those external fixed things really no longer apply. We tend to think of ourselves now as the masters of our own destiny. I live 3,500, 4,000 miles away from where I was brought up in an entirely different continent, entirely different country. I perceive myself and I perceive the world around me as something that I have great freedom relative towards, that I can choose, that I can be whoever I want to be. And it's that modern notion of the autonomous, independent self that I think underlies so many of the ethical debates and discussions we're having today.
You also go on to talk about the expressive individualism. Is that different than the modern self, or is that similar?
No, I think it's another term really for the modern self, and I should probably qualify and say the modern Western self. I'm not sure that the same model would apply in Russia or China or India or Korea. We're really talking about Western Europe and North America. And the expressive individual is the person who thinks of themselves as primarily constituted by their inner feelings, their own inner convictions, and who sees their authenticity as involving the ability to express those inward feelings outwardly. And it's in doing that that we find happiness. And of course, the implication of that is that everybody else is either a problem to us or instrumental to our happiness.
Mm-hmm.
That we find our happiness for ourselves, and other people are useful to us to the extent that they can contribute to that sense of happiness.
So how does that contribute to what's going on in America and the Western world as far as the social issues go?
Well, if you look at the sexual revolution and look at the rise of sexual identity politics, LGBTQ+,
Mm-hmm.
really at the core of sexual identity politics is this idea that I am constituted by my desires or inner feelings. If I have a desire, sexual desire for somebody of the same sex, then that is who I am.
Mm-hmm.
If you contrast that with, say, ancient Greece, where there was a lot of homosexual activity, but nobody was identifying as a homosexual because they didn't think of their identity in terms of their desires. So that would be one aspect of expressive individualism. I know you're particularly interested in the abortion issue.
Right.
Think about abortion. What does expressive individualism teach us or tilt us towards doing? I said earlier, regarding other people as instrumental to our happiness. So when the woman falls pregnant and has a child in her womb that she thinks is going to bring great happiness to her life, then it's fine to bring it to term. But if the woman falls pregnant and feels that the child is going to inhibit her career, inhibit her ability to express herself, inhibit her freedom, then that child becomes an adversary, an enemy, and ripe, of
Mm-hmm.
course, for abortion at that point.
Mm-hmm. My guest again is Dr. Carl Trueman. We're talking about the video series that is on the Grove City YouTube page, Life of the Mind, Great Lectures from the Grove, as well as his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Dr. Trueman, let's jump in. I want to go over just a couple of the different parts of that video that you created there, Makers of the Modern Revolution. You talk about Freud's legacy and that sex is the foundation for human happiness and identity. If you would expound on that a bit.
Yeah, well, Freud is an absolutely critical person, I think, in terms of understanding the intellectual genealogy of where we are today.
Hmm.
Freud doesn't emerge from a vacuum. He comes at the end of several centuries where human beings had, well, certainly Western thinkers had become increasingly preoccupied with inner psychology as defining who we are. So you have the Romantic movement that sees our inner feelings as defining who we are. Freud is a sort of heir of the Romantics in that he agrees that it's that inner space that's important for our identity, but he sees it as a dark sexual place. It's really
Hmm.
defined by our dark, unmentionable sexual desires. And in doing that, what Freud does is he shifts sexual desire to the center of what it means to be a person. He makes sexual desire an identity. Sex, if you like, ceases to be an activity that you do and becomes that which you are. So Freud is critical. Now, people listening to this podcast might say, yeah, but nobody reads Freud today, et cetera, et cetera. But Freud's message is the message that's preached by 80% of the commercials we watch,
Hmm.
80% of the movies we watch. The
Hmm.
idea that you are your sexual desires and your happiness is constituted by fulfilling those sexual desires is now common currency in our culture.
Dr. Trueman's book, you can pick it up at the Christian bookstores online. Christianbook.com is one of them where you can pick up the book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's my guest today. Uh, Dr. Trueman, I want to go on to one of these the videos, video number 7. You talk about sexual politics, and you talk about how sexual codes are now seen as the tools of the oppressors. And in order to dismantle those codes, that is at the heart of the political revolution. We see that happening now. And it's just at light speed after the Obergefell decision of 2015. Would you expound on that, and where do you think this is headed?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Uh, Obviously, it connects to what I've just said about Freud. If you think
Right.
about it, if your sexual desires are constitutive of who you are, then that means that sexual codes, the laws by which society
Hmm.
regulates itself sexually, are not so much laws about behavior as they are laws about who you are allowed to be by the society
Right.
in which you live. So it's
Right.
inevitable, once the Freudian message had been sort of absorbed into the culture, that sexual identity would move to the center of political struggles. And that's what I think we're witnessing today. We've seen it with the lesbian and the gay movement. Now we're seeing it with the transgender and the queer movement.
Hmm.
So that's where we are. Where is it heading? I think it's very disturbing.
Right.
One of the things that Freud, I think, gets right is that Freud, in his wonderful essay, Civilization, Its Discontents, Freud makes the case, and it makes quite a compelling case, I think, for saying that sexual codes lie at the heart of civilization. It's sexual codes that define the family. It's sexual codes that
Hmm.
really lie at the heart of how we relate to each other as human beings. And that makes them important. It means that when you change sexual codes, you are changing some of the fundamental essence of civilization. Debates about sexual codes, if you like, are not debates about marginal rates of income tax. People can have strong convictions about income tax, but a difference between 20% and 25% is not as great as the difference between believing that marriage is between one man and one woman and believing that marriage is a relationship that can be defined by the contracting parties in whichever way they wish. The transformation of sexual codes is a very, very serious thing. And I think our culture is hurtling down that railroad with no idea of where this will go and no idea of whether civilization will be in any level sustainable at the end.
In video 8 of your series, the modern makers of the modern revolution, you talk about abortion a little bit in that. You talk about Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and you refer to the quote mystery passage unquote, and how that affects personhood. If you would expound on that, what did you mean by the mystery passage? This is this is Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote for the majority in Planned Parenthood versus Casey.
Yeah, there is this famous passage. It's quoted all the time now, particularly by people like me, I guess, where the majority, and it's really Anthony Kennedy authoring this. Anthony Kennedy argues really that personhood and happiness are not things that the state can have any interest in defining. That has to be left up to the individual. It's a passage of profound mysticism, I would say, and it seems to have no real purchase on reality and flies in the face of common sense. The government has every interest in defining personhood. That's what allows us to have codes about murder and things like this. It's really, I think, a little bit of emotional special pleading on the part of Justice Kennedy that allows the majority to avoid taking the correct stand in the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case.
And so how does that affect personhood, the person of the unborn?
Well, they have no personhood.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that there's an implication, and I'm not sure that Anthony Kennedy would have connected these dots, but it seems to me that what it does is it denies personhood to anybody who isn't self-conscious in some significant way. And that,
Mhm.
of course, not only has implications for the unborn, it also has implications at the other end of life when you have somebody struggling with dementia. If personhood and happiness depend upon self consciousness, then the extremes of life are profoundly vulnerable at that point. That's a point that's been made very powerfully by my friend Carter Snead in his recent book, What It Means to Be Human, that I would recommend to your listeners to get hold of
Mhm.
and read.
Mhm. Again, I'm talking to Dr. Carl Trueman. You can watch the video series on the Life of the Mind, Great Lectures from the Grove. That's the YouTube channel, and the presentation is Makers of the Modern Revolution. Uh, Dr. Trueman, in on video 8, talking a little more about abortion and personhood, you reference Peter Singer, who's professor at Princeton University, sits on the bioethics board, I think, there. And you talk about how well, he's an animal rights activist, among other things. And you talk about how he believes there is no such thing as human exceptionalism, and that personal happiness is the key to whether the unborn deserve rights or not. If you would elaborate on Peter Singer and his worldview.
Yeah, Singer is an interesting character. I teach him. I do a class on Peter Singer each year in one
Wow.
of my courses at Grove. And
Uh-huh.
don't get me wrong, when I say I like Singer, it's not that I like his views. What I appreciate about Peter Singer is he's remarkably consistent.
Yeah.
He writes very
Yes.
clearly, and he does not hesitate to draw the logical, clear conclusions from the premises that he sets forward.
Mhm.
Singer makes, I think, a good point in arguing that human exceptionalism was ultimately grounded in a theological view of the world.
Right.
Singer sees human exceptionalism in terms of how it's been embodied in philosophies as really parasitic upon the Jewish or the Christian idea that human beings are made in the image of God and have certain
Mhm.
tasks placed upon them and a certain authority given to them that is not given to other creatures. And Singer then makes the point, well, that is not the consensus position of society anymore. We're not a Christian society in that sense, and therefore we can't use such arguments for human exceptionalism. And what does that mean? It means that human beings, well, sounds a truism, we're not exceptional. We're just one form of animal in amongst many others. And therefore, why should we argue that we should have special privileges or special rights
Mhm.
relative to others? Famous statement by the chief executive of PETA some years ago: a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. That sort of captures very much in a popular way what Singer
Mhm.
is trying to do. And having said that, he then tries to rebuild his ethics, as you pointed out in the question, on the grounds of, well, okay, if we take certain actions, do they lead to greater amount of happiness or a lesser amount of happiness? If the child is born with disabilities, for example, and the
Right.
parents still rejoice in the birth of the child and want to bring the child up, then that's great. The child should be allowed to live at that point. If the parents are devastated by this and think that bringing up a child with disabilities is going to harm their happiness, then it's okay to euthanize the child at that point, because, touching on Anthony Kennedy, the child is not a person. Child does
Mhm.
not have a degree of self-consciousness at that point that would allow it to be considered to be a person.
Right, and Singer makes the case in Practical Ethics that he makes the case that, we should ascribe rights of personhood at sentience, whether they're human or not, and he would say that that actually takes place 28 days after birth, for human beings, so he would put them on the level with any other, you know, part of the creation, human or otherwise, so it's an interesting argument. But I guess if you don't believe in the fact that we are all made in the image of God, that's probably where you end up. So, Dr. Trueman, I'd like to ask you a couple contemporary questions. We've got this Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization case that's going to be handed down by the Supreme Court, maybe as early as spring, but as late as the summer. Do you see any further expectations or change or signals that the court might be sending on the issue of personhood or not? Because Casey's at the center of a lot of the discussions amongst the justices and others.
Yeah, I've not seen that thus far. I mean, I will
Right.
rejoice, of course, if Roe v. Wade is overturned. And I think the very existence of the Dobbs case indicates how public opinion has shifted in the United States,
Mhm.
probably in large part as a result of the development of sonograms and things like that,
Right.
where
The
yeah,
visuals, yeah.
it's a kind of intuitive. Yeah, we intuitively see the child in the womb as a person now. We may not have the philosophy for doing that. So, pragmatically, I'm very pleased with the way things are going. Philosophically, I think the notion of personhood underlying Casey, that's part of our broader culture. I don't think that's
Right.
going anywhere soon.
Right, agreed, agreed. So let me ask you this: since you wrote the book, "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self," it's been a little while since that was released. Do you see any hope since you've written that book? I mean, have there been changes, positive changes, regarding that, or no?
I've been I've been very encouraged by the reception of the book. I
Okay,
expected a lot more hostility than I received.
okay.
And I've been encouraged that some of the most moving letters I've had have been from parents of children who are struggling with the sexual revolution stuff, the LGBTQ stuff, saying that the
Mhm.
book has enabled them to have conversations with their children they'd not been able to have before. So I've been encouraged in a small way on that front. I think though the power of the culture is so
Mm,
great that, if
yeah,
anything, my book functions as it explains the culture, but it's not transforming the culture in any way. The forces driving our culture are much greater than any single book or argument could ever address.
Well, and we agree with you there. It doesn't mean we don't keep up the fight and, and
No.
continue to point to the truth and make our case in the public square. Last question: where do you think we're headed in the short term, and how do you believe that the church should be responding to what's going on?
Yeah, in the short term, I think we have to. I'm. This sounds very. I'm a sort of cheerful pessimist. I'm resigned to the fact that I'm probably going to lose every cultural battle I fight in my lifetime, but I'm still going to
Likewise,
fight them.
likewise.
Like Theoden, I'm still going to go onto the field of battle, even though I know I'm going to lose. Uh,
Uh-huh.
but I also think we need to remember that our world is interesting. That we now think in such short term ways. You think of a man who started on the day one of the building of Cologne Cathedral. As
Hmm.
he laid the first foundation stone, he would have known that he was never going to worship in that building. He was never going to see it completed. And I
Right.
think our generation need to get over the idea that we need to win every battle in the next week or 6 months and realize what we're doing today is building for the future. And so I would add that the church on that front needs to be the church. Keep proclaiming the gospel, keep living a disciplined Christian life, keep witnessing to the world that there is a way to live to the beat of a different drum.
My guest today has been Dr. Carl Trueman, and he is professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College. And he's written several books, one most recently, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. You can pick that book up at christianbook.com. I also encourage you to watch the video series, which is on the Life of the Mind Great Lectures from the Grove, which is the Grove City YouTube page. And one of his presentations there is Makers of the Modern Revolution. Thank you, Dr. Trueman, for being on the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed listening to Dr. Carl Thompson, who I would consider one of America's foremost Christian apologists and intellectuals. And what I really liked about Carl Thompson or Carl Trueman's position is that, all the issues that we're facing, the social issues, if you will, the culture war issues, did not happen in a vacuum. In other words, we as Christians need to have a well rounded worldview in order to deal with these. And I think that's what separates Created Equal from a lot of other anti abortion organizations. Yes, we fight against abortion. Yes, we want to end abortion. We are focused on that particular injustice. But we understand that there are a lot of other contributing factors that play into the fact that abortion is legal in America. One of those is what's currently going on with the COVID pandemic, specifically the mandates that are being handed down by the federal government, by mayors across America. And this is why I often speak about it, because I believe that the mandates are unconstitutional, they're immoral, and therefore they need to be stood against because it does affect our ability to fight abortion. How is that? Well, first of all, the vaccines were derived by the use of aborted fetal cells. In other words, the shot, the injection, is tainted by abortion. Therefore, it's off limits for Christians to take. Number one. Number two, we've shown that there are adverse effects to it. In other words, people are dying, they're having adverse reactions. Specifically, when it comes to pregnancy, we are now seeing that over 80% of women who are pregnant in the first and second trimester of pregnancy who take the vaccine lose their pregnancies. They have miscarriages. That's not pro-life to support a vaccine that causes miscarriage. And then finally, the threat against the First Amendment. And that is a big, big thing. We cannot have the end of abortion without freedom of expression. There is no social reform without freedom of speech. So that's why Created Equal tries to tackle all of these issues, still focusing primarily on abortion. And so, folks, I want you to take action. And here's how you can. On January 22nd, yours truly, along with the Created Equal team, will be in Washington, D.C. We'll be displaying our Jumbotron TV, showing first trimester and second trimester aborted babies to the marchers as they pass by. Hundreds of thousands of individuals will be exposed to the truth about abortion. We'll be in Washington, and we ask you to pray for us. Pray that we reach more and more people with the truth of abortion and the gospel. Secondarily, you can listen to the podcast, The Mark Harrington Show, 24/7 by picking it up on any of the popular podcasting platforms. And you can go to markharringtonshow.com to check those out. And then finally, leave a comment, submit a comment, suggest a topic for the program. You can do that by clicking on the tab on the right-hand side of the page at markharringtonshow.com. So we'll see you next time. God bless you. God bless America. And remember, America, to bless God.
You've been listening to Mark Harrington, your radio activist. For more information on how to make a difference for the cause of life, liberty, and justice, go to createdequal.org. To follow Mark, go to markharringtonshow.com. Be sure to tune in next time for your marching orders in the culture war.